Hello everyone, hello listeners, good day, welcome to the newest podcast in town, the POSHpod, where we'll be talking about a whole host of issues around sexual harassment laws in India. Now, the law around sexual harassment, which is known as POSH, which is the Prevention of Sexual Harassment Act, has now been around since 2013. But the efficacy of the law, of course, depends on how well the employers implement the law. And there have been lots of challenges with the implementation over the years, so many grey areas under the POSH Act that we felt it would be useful to have a pod like this for employees, for internal committee members, for in-house legal counsel, for HR, to maybe for us to impart what little we know on the subject to make implementation of the law easier. Now, to quickly introduce for you our host for this show, my name is Bishen Jeswant. With me I have Laxmi Char. Laxmi has about 20 years of experience in the industry. Laxmi is the co-founder of Parity Consulting. Parity Consulting looks to enhance and build inclusivity in the workspace with special focus on prevention of sexual harassment. We look forward to working together on this show, bringing to you many podcasts on many episodes on issues around sexual harassment, and hopefully in course of time, improve the way in which we deal with sexual harassment at the workplace. Laxmi?
And folks, it's exciting for me, Bishen, to be working with you, the one of the youngest partners for the labor law and employment practice at CAM. And I know that in your professional role, you've been an advisor to several global and Indian organizations in the space of POSH in terms of as you mentioned, the implementation of POSH, as well as perhaps some of the challenges, some of the gray areas that we've been seeing. And if we really look at the POSH Act itself, yes, it is, the 2013-2014 time frame, but we do know, and speaking as a woman citizen of this country, we do know that even before the act was promulgated, that as a woman, I did have recourse to the law, right? I mean, we have this phrase which is outraging a woman's modesty. We have the very, very famous Rupan Deol Bajaj case. And then, of course, the 1997 Vishakha guidelines, which I think kind of solidified and refined a lot of the thought process that was around this. And then after the cultural flashpoint of Nirbhaya, we now have the POSH Act, right? Something which I had asked you earlier and you had kind of shared with me. Why do we need an act if the Vishakha guidelines were pretty strong and pretty straightforward? And something which you taught me and for me was really interesting, the POSH Act is significantly more refined. It is specific. It calls out, the responsibilities of an employer. And there are very specific penalties and consequences attached to it, right? So if the act is saying that every organization must have an internal committee, and we know that all organizations are not big and glorious like the Googles and the Reliances and the Amazons and the Tatas of the world, what happens to a smaller organization that perhaps has offices in more than one city in India, has employees in more than one city in India? So does that mean that they have to replicate this IC in each location?
Yeah, fair question. And you'll hear us discuss some issues like this, which are around setting up of the IC, which is the first step really to compliance with the POSH Act. Because if you don't have the committee in place, you cannot deal with issues of sexual harassment. So to answer your question, Laxmi, on what happens if you are in multiple cities, like you said, if you're a big company, maybe you're okay with setting up a separate internal committee. You'll hear us refer to them as ICs in each city. But if you're a small organization, the law still very specifically says that if you have 10 or more employees, workers at a location, you must have an IC at that location. Now, it's often difficult to have an IC at each location if you have only 12, 13 people, because an IC needs 4 members. IC may not have, it needs to have members who have experience in dealing with issues around women. You may not have those employees at that workplace. The profile of people, we often see this issue with, say, supermarkets. They are establishments, 10 in the city. You can't have a separate IC at each supermarket. So what do? And the answer here is we have to take a practical call in these kind of situations, and even authorities are practical about this. So while the law says the ideal situation is that you must have an IC for each establishment with 10 or more people, if you can have, let's say, a common IC across the country, let's say 4 members, and you say that whenever there is an issue that comes up from the Baroda supermarket, you will nominate one person from that supermarket into your IC as well, so that you can deal with that issue in a manner that has nominated members from across ICs. So there are workarounds like that. You could have some companies that have, let's say, a large panel. The law says 4 members on the IC. You could have a larger panel of, say, 10 members on the IC, representing a wide variety of geographies. And then when an issue comes up from one of the offices, you co-opt a smaller number of members from that larger IC to form a specific IC for that matter. So there are some of these workarounds like this. We have to be practical about this ultimately, because it may not be realistic to have an IC at every single office.
That's a really good point. And then can we also extrapolate that in the sense of, because the law also says you have to have a woman as the presiding officer, right? And we know that 10, 12, 13 people, right? It's not necessary that you have senior women in each of these locations, right? So can you have one woman who's a presiding officer across India? How does that play out?
So this is a big issue, right? I mean, if we look at the demography of workplaces in India across the world, 70 to 75%, especially at senior management, are men, right? That number comes down a little bit at mid to junior level. And the law says that the woman who is the presiding officer must be a senior level woman. And so you really have a very small pool to choose from. But fortunately, what the law allows you here is to provide for women from group companies to also be co-opted into your IC. So exactly like you've said, you can have, let's say I'm part of the Tata Group, Tata Motors, and Tata Sons is the larger group, and you can have a presiding officer from Tata Sons who's on the Tata Motors, IC, for example. So it is possible, and the law allows for this as well, keeping in mind that there may not be enough women employees at the senior level. So what have you seen, though? What has been your experience?
So I've seen a bit of both, right? Like you said, there are some organizations that are choosing to invest in this in both the letter and the spirit. So exactly like what you're saying is, finding a group of people who are truly, and the law talks about it as well, right? Committed to the cause of preventing sexual harassment, bringing together a group of people, putting them through the upskilling, the training, the sensitivity, and all of that, all the stuff that's required. And then creating maybe, I don't know if this is the right term, like mini committees to investigate a particular this thing, right? Yeah. I think also from, keeping exactly like what you said, that there really are not enough senior women and that's a different problem and a different topic for a different day. But, when we have a woman as the presiding officer and she's this thing, I think the corollary to that also is how comfortable are people in the IC to be publicly recognized as being in the IC. So it's not something private. It's not that, my HR person sends me an email and says, hey, Laxmi, you're on the IC, congratulations, and I'm thrilled to bits, and I don't tell anybody about it, right? We publish this. So there is that sense of, some organizations, it's really a sense of giving back and a sense of pride that, there is this personal value that I have that I'm bringing to the organization. And unfortunately, we're also seeing, to be very honest, certain situations where, people need to be persuaded to join the IC, right? So in terms of time commitment, in terms of, I have a day job. And you're asking me to do this something extra. Yeah. So I think that there's an operational challenge that organizations face over there. I mean, how do you foresee that element playing out?
So just to pick up from what you said about HR possibly sending the individual an email to say, you're part of the IC, and how does that setting up of an IC process work? Maybe we can talk a little bit about that, right? Now, setting up of an IC seems like a straightforward thing because the Act says you need to set up an IC, have an order in writing, right? But most companies grapple with what exactly does that mean? Does that mean HR can just send out communication to the 3-4 IC members saying you're part of the IC? Does it mean the CEO sends that out? What does that mean? So the law requires an employer to pass an order in writing nominating these members. Now, who is an employer? An employer is defined in the act, but it's broadly a person who's in the head of the organization, in charge of the affairs of the company, in charge of overall supervision and control. Now, this person, and this can be more than one person in an organization, is responsible for nominating the IC. So the practical way to do this would be, and we get this question quite a lot from employers on how do we set this up, would be to have a board meeting where you nominate these 4 members, have a resolution passed by the board saying A, B, C, D are part of the IC for a period of 3 years, which is what the act allows you to have them for, and then publish an extract of that board resolution where everybody can see. That's a requirement under the act as well, to disseminate and in a conspicuous place display the members of the IC. So that's the process broadly that is to be followed, because there is a definition of an employer, because the law says it must be done in writing. This is probably the most practical way to give effect to that process. Now, very often, the committee constitution includes 2 employee members, 1 external member, and 1 senior woman who is a presiding officer who is a senior woman. Now, senior women, can they be a foreigner? Is also a question that comes up very often, because like we said, there aren't enough senior women in your company in India. Have you seen that happen?
Yes, we do actually, and that's so interesting. And we're seeing that also in a lot of startup phases, because again, from just the reality of the startup is that they do have significantly lower number of employees, and many startups are extensions of organizations that are already in existence outside of India, right? So you have maybe the head of HR, or you have the head of operations who happens to be a foreign citizen, sometimes of Indian origin, not necessarily always. And something that we at Parity, that we've encouraged people to say that, look, the law does not prevent it, but there is a cultural sensitization, because sexual harassment, especially in India, and when we're talking about women, there is a social, I'm going to use the word stigma, really. There is a social stigma that is attached to a woman who says, my name is Laxmi and I have been harassed. So it's important that when you have somebody on the IC, that they have that sense of respect and that sense of fair play, when they're investigating an issue. So while we know the law is, has been silent about it, right? It hasn't said yes, it hasn't said no. But I think there are some operational elements and some cultural elements that's important for us to keep track of, right?
I want to just give an example there. I like this example for how a foreign presiding officer often has issues. For example, kissing as a manner of greeting, right? In France, it's 1 kiss. Whereas in Spain, it's 2 kisses, right? Whereas in Afghanistan, it's 8 kisses apparently, but not between members of the opposite sex, right? So in India, kissing is not part of greeting. So it's really different everywhere. And if you're from a different cultural background, you sometimes aren't able to relate to what is acceptable in one country versus what's acceptable in your own. So while you can, like Laxmi said, have a foreigner who's part of the IC as a presiding officer, especially as a presiding officer, there's an onus on them to manage the whole proceeding, and therefore it's harder. It's harder for a foreign citizen, but understandably many Indian companies may not at the highest level have senior women, and therefore they have to draw from their expertise from their parent companies, which may be at the global level.
It's so interesting because as a result of COVID, we've all gone into the namaskara mode. So, forget about kissing. We don't even we hesitate to even shake hands, which also is a cultural element, right? And it's also a question of smaller organizations, smaller cities or towns, the bigger organizations, bigger this thing and stuff. And I think that's where really, and again, speaking for myself, having been an employee member of the internal committee and now as an external member of various committees, I think that's kind of a value that the external member brings. And again, the Act talks about mandatorily having an external member, but not necessarily what and how the external member needs to associate with the IC, right? So again, going back to the letter and the spirit, we do have organizations that are very clear and very inclusive and very focused on including the external member in every conversation, in every meeting, in every sort of deliberation. And other organizations that are like, okay, you know what, we'll do the investigation and we'll do all of this. And then when we are ready, external member, we'll call you in, right? So it's still in the process, I think, of getting figured out and getting refined, and lots of good conversations. And I think that for me is the really supportive and encouraging thing that I'm seeing.
I think that's bringing us towards the end of this episode, but I want to add one point on this external members being part of the IC before we wrap up. And it's a question that we get very often. Does an external member need to be part of every investigation, right? Because the Act very clearly says that you must have a quorum for each investigation, right? For each meeting that happens as part of an inquiry. And that's 3 members who must be there out of the maximum of 4, and one of them must be the presiding officer, which allows you leeway there to leave out the external member. But when this question comes to us, it's very hard to say it's fine to leave out the external member, because that's the one person who's neutral, that's the one person who has real expertise in this matter. So we always, as a good practice, would recommend having the external member as part of the inquiry committee for every meeting. And even if you have a quorum of 3, make sure it includes the external member, something that we would always say.
So what we're saying is presiding officer, external member, and one, or if possible, have
both of the employee members.
You did say it's the end, and I respect that, but I have one final question for you, Bishen. And again, this is coming from organizations asking. So the law says 4. The reality of in the workplace is we've got a 90-day deadline to complete this whole thing, and everybody has day jobs. And if you have a relatively senior constituent membership of the IC, people travel or they've got other commitments and stuff. Do you think, we talked about the good practice of having the EM, and do you think it makes sense for an organization to start an IC with 5 people, so that if through the 90-day period one person is not available, the IC can still continue?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Laxmi. It's a fair, good practice to have as well. So even if you have only 4 when you start and one person drops out, you can have meetings with only 3 because the quorum is 3. So you don't necessarily need to have the 4th member for all the meetings, as long as that person is part of the committee and part of, I suppose, eventual decision making. But I mean, the more the better, right? But always an odd number as much as possible. The law says 4 people on the committee, but we always say better to have 5 for the reason that you can always break a tie with the 5th person. So there's rarely a deadlock when there are 5 people. So for that reason as well, I agree with you that it makes sense to have 5 people on the IC.
Because again, if you have only 3 people left, then all 3 people have to mandatorily attend every meeting and be prepared for everything and stuff like that. I know that we're going to talk a little bit more about other elements about the Act. We're going to talk about why the Act focuses only on women and other good stuff around that. But from a kind of IC constitution, wrap, so to say, we do also know that it's important for us to take notes and to make sure that everybody in the IC, including the complainant, the witness, the respondent, or whoever, has access to these notes, right? In today's world, and especially with the whole COVID scenario, when most of us have gone into digital meetings, virtual meetings and stuff, how does that impact the working of the IC? Which is really going to be my last question of the day. Thank you for your patience.
No, not at all. No, so taking notes is important. And as part of taking notes, I think as important is taking minutes which you get them to sign off, right? Because the notes are for yourself, but ultimately those can be disputed. And a good practice here would be to make sure that the notes are essentially minutes of the meeting. And if you can get the witnesses, respondent, complainant to sign off on those as notes that are actually what they have said at this meeting, that reduces the chances of your investigation being challenged. And I think that would be a good practice. Definitely would recommend it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Bishen.
Thank you,
It was
Laxmi.
wonderful chatting with
Absolutely.
you. Looking forward to the next time we catch up.
And the next time we catch up is going to be on discussing whether the POSH Act allows anonymous complaints or not. Today we spoke to all of you a little bit about the various grey areas and the setting up of an IC. Next time will be on whether anonymous complaints are possible or not. And at this point, we'd like to quickly thank a few people as well. Laxmi, thank you very much. Thank you to Parity as well as Cam for being the knowledge partner on this podcast. I would also like to thank Pickle Jar who have helped us support and create this podcast. So thank you very much. And to all of you, thank you for listening. Hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you have, please do like, please do subscribe. And we'd like to hear from all of you as well. So we'd love to hear from you in the comment section as well. Look forward to the next episode when we'll be discussing whether anonymous complaints are possible for making POSH complaints.